So today I started an inquiry. I asked first in my head, I asked myself, and then I went on to do a little bit of research, which pretty much confirmed my initial hypothesis, my initial intuition. And I asked, is there any a priori way to establish a negative existential proposition, the truth of a negative existential proposition, like, which means the truth of a proposition that states that something does not exist, or to refute the hypothesis a priori in an a priori way, besides reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity. And I thought there wasn't, right? So I went on to ask ChatGPT, and it pretty much listed uh, a few what it named methods of a priori refutation of a hypothesis or establishment of a negative existential proposition, which pretty much reduced to logical deduction or conceptual analysis, or demonstrating an inconsistency or incoherence within a hypothesis, which pretty much all boils down to establishing that there is a certain contradiction that follows from the proposition, and then we can establish that proposition is false, and therefore we can establish that its negation or its contradictory is true, right? So reductio ad absurdum can both be seen as a way of refutation of a certain hypothesis, which pretty much by itself establishes the truth of the negation of that hypothesis. So it can be both seen as a way of proof and as a way of refutation. But that works only if we already assume or accept the truth of the law of non-contradiction, or the law of excluded middle, which are part of the three axioms of classical two-valued logic, bivalent logic. So I went on to ask whether that contradiction is supposed to follow from that initial hypothesis uh, can be shown in any way that doesn't really presuppose it in the hypothesis itself. So can a contradiction follow from a hypothesis that is not really already contained within that hypothesis, or implicitly implicitly uh, implicitly already present in the hypothesis itself? And pretty much my research brought me to the conclusion that it cannot. So reductio ad absurdum can only work by showing that some hypothesis, together with some other accepted truth or axiom or principle that is accepted independently of the hypothesis, from a general web of beliefs, together imply contradiction, or are mutually inconsistent, or mutually exclusive, or mutually contradictory, right? So what I thought is that we cannot really assume, we cannot really derive a contradictory statement, or from a simple proposition that doesn't single simple proposition that doesn't already contain a contradiction within it. I would say even more generally, we cannot deduce, we cannot derive, we cannot infer any proposition at all from a single proposition. So we need at least two premises for a syllogism to work. I don't think we can derive anything from a single proposition. Now I may be I may be open, or I may be ready to make an exception for that kind of rule when it comes to certain, maybe purely logical or mathematical propositions, but I am also skeptical about those. I would like if somebody would be able to show how something can follow from a single proposition, how anything can follow from a single proposition. I think more generally, when we say that something follows from a single proposition, we are using what Aristotle in his rhetoric, or in his informal logic, called anti-meme. So anti-meme is basically an informal logical tool, rhetorical tool, that seems to derive a proposition from a single proposition, another proposition from a single proposition, but actually, when we logically explicate it, there needs to be a hidden premise, or a hidden background assumption in addition to that premise, that we kind of just remain, we just keep unsaid in that certain instance or regard. We keep it uh, implicit, maybe for some rhetorical purpose, but logically, that is really required for the derivation of any hypothesis, any further proposition from a single proposition. So, for example, when we say, for example, Robert Brandom uses that example when he says, for example, this is something, some this is red, therefore that something is colored. So that seems like a what some may call a material condition or a material implication for one proposition to another without an additional second premise or second assumption. But actually, when we look at it more closely, we would have to assume that red is a color for us to be able to infer logically and validly from something's being red to something being colored. So if red wasn't a color, then something's being red doesn't imply that it is colored. Or there's another famous example in the history of philosophy when Descartes says, for example, that I think, therefore I am. So that is actually a logical conclusion, but it doesn't by itself follow from I think that I am. But we need to assume that whatever thinks exists. So you cannot think without existing. And if something cannot think without existing, then its thinking implies it's existing. So that is the major premise, basically, that is actually left, or I think that's a major premise, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the complex premise, then it needs to be a premise of implication, I think, in every deductive argument, and a simple premise that is more like a factual premise, a single factual premise. So when we talk about reductio ad absurdum, we can maybe spot it. I give you two like historical examples, one from the West and one from the East. For example, we can spot it in Sextus Empiricus, in the writings of Sextus Empiricus, on the dogmatists, on Pyrrhonian skepticism, system of Pyrrhonian skepticism, and where he tries to refute a lot, really a lot of statements of dogmatists, or statements of positive knowledge, statements of people that claim to have achieved positive knowledge of some area of inquiry or some part of reality, where he tries to actually find a contradiction that is implicit in those assumptions, or tries to derive a contradiction from those assumptions, therefore refute those assumptions. Or maybe in the East also, you can find in Nagarjuna in the Madhyamaka school, in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, I think that's the name of the text. You can find the application of the reductio ad absurdum, even though they may not call it that, but it's very similar, if not identical, in form and in purpose to some of the Western uses, where he tries to refute pretty much a lot of the propositions of, I guess, also positive knowledge. Maybe we can even look at that position as skeptical, but I think we can find a certain parallel between those two systems of philosophy, the Buddhist and the Greek Pyrrhonian skeptic one. For example, the Pyrrhonian skeptic wants to establish Pyrrhonian skepticism, right, which is pretty much the middle ground between dogmatism on the one hand and academic skepticism on the other. So dogmatism says that we can know things, and we do know things for certain and for sure, and with a certain reliability and assurance. And the academic skeptic wants to say we cannot know anything for sure, and he claims that to know that for sure, that we cannot know anything for sure, right? Which may be contradicted in itself, but the Pyrrhonian skeptics tries to establish a middle ground where it says that we don't even know whether we know anything or not. We don't even know if we know anything or not. And the Buddhist Madhyamaka, for example, Nagarjuna, wants to establish a position that is between eternalism on the one hand and eternalism on the one hand, and what do they call it? An annihilationism, or maybe nihilism would be a better term. Nihilism on the other. So he wants to establish that I think, if my interpretation isn't misrepresenting Arjuna in some way. I think he wants to establish there are only relative truths, so whatever is true, only relatively true, which may be connected to the Buddhist doctrine of interdependent arising or interdependent origination. Pratitya samutpada, if I'm not mistaken, is the Sanskrit Buddhist term for interdependent origination, where there are no absolutely independent entities in existence. Everything is dependent causally on everything else. So there's a middle ground between eternalism and nihilism, which says that nothing exists. Eternalism that says that things exist independently, have their own nature, or some kind of intrinsic nature, as some of the maybe Indian dogmatists will want to say, maybe something like the Nyaya school or something like that. Vaishesika metaphysicians, maybe. So to try to wrap up what I wanted to say in this particular installment on my channel is more generally that from a single proposition, from a single isolated proposition, nothing really follows. So we need at least two premises, and two premises that are related in a very specific kind of way for us to be able to infer anything from them. And in addition, I would say a problem with deduction more generally is that, as Descartes may have pointed out, that it can really establish any new truths. It can only explicate what's already contained within the premises. It can only bring it to light, or it can only turn a tacit assumption or an implicit assumption into explicit hypothesis. So deduction, if deductive argument, deductive syllogism, if valid, preserves the truth of the premises with certainty. So if we are certain in the truth of the premises, we can be certain in the truth of the conclusion, basically. So that would imply also that if we have only probable knowledge, if we have only probable justification of the premises, we can only have probable justification of the conclusion at the best. So pretty much the epistemic standard, the epistemic norm, the epistemic justification of the premises transfers to the conclusion. So whatever degree of reliability or certainty we have in the premises, we also can have logically about the conclusion. But the premises also need to be true for us to be able to know that the conclusion is true. So the validity isn't enough. We also need soundness of the premises, or the truth of the premises, in order to establish the truth of the conclusion. So that is kind of my more general conclusion here, or my general point here. The more specific point is that, so from a single proposition, just like you cannot derive anything from a single proposition, you cannot derive also, or you can neither derive a contradiction from a single isolated proposition. So Reductio ad absurdum doesn't really work by inferring or deriving some contradiction from a single premise, and therefore showing that premise to be false and its negation true. But it also needs some other hypothesis, some other assumptions, some other maybe established truths, or at least believed truths, in addition to that hypothesis, that are established on independent grounds. They have independent reasons for believing. Because deduction only works with at least two premises. So that kind of brings me back full circle to my initial question. The Reductio ad absurdum seems to me to be the only a priori method of establishing the falsity of some proposition, the refutation of that proposition, or establishing the negative existential proposition of the non-existence of something. So, for example, people often say you cannot really prove the non-existence of God in debates about theism and religion. You cannot establish the non-existence of God because even if we agree that there's an absence of evidence for God, it doesn't establish the evidence for absence. But I would object to that, maybe, that we can actually prove that, so to speak, if we assume the only thing we need to assume is pretty much the the law of non-contradiction, and the very definition that is offered by the theists themselves, the proponents of theism themselves, the definition of God, that is, right? So if we can find, for example, there are two ways of establishing. For example, I will give an example of the existence of God. There are two ways of establishing the non-existence of God. One is a priori, purely a priori, and the other is partly a posteriori. So one is, for example, to spot a contradiction, or to spot incompatibility relation between multiple properties, ascribed properties of God, or believed properties of God. For example, his let's say his omniscience or perfect knowledge, and his omnipotence or perfect power and infinite power. So if God is perfectly knowledgeable, so then he knows what will happen in the future, and therefore he cannot really stop what he knows will happen in the future, because if he can stop it, he didn't really know that it will happen in the first place, because knowledge implies truth, right? But also there's an a posteriori way to prove the non-existence of a God, so defined as defined by is usually defined by Orthodox monotheistic religions or theistic traditions, and that is by finding contradiction between that notion of God, or that potential entity that God is supposed to be, and some fact of the world. For example, the fact of evil, the existence of evil in the world. So if God is perfectly good and is able to stop evil, so why is there evil in the world? And that is a posteriori argument for the non-existence of God. So there are ways, there are at least two ways that I pointed out that you can establish the non-existence of something. In this case, God. Maybe potentially, maybe there are counter arguments, of course, but this is at least an attempt at a refutation, a prior refutation of the existence of something. So we can only also have negative evidence in addition to positive evidence. So that kind of refutation, by finding a contradiction within the very definition of God, may be seen as a negative counterpart or negative correlate of the positive ontological argument for God. So this is a priori ontological, so to speak, argument from the very definition of God to the non-existence of God, because there's a contradiction within the very definition of God. So I'll end this by saying that Reductio ad absurdum can at best establish that something that follows from a certain hypothesis is false based on independent grounds or reasons external to that very proposition. You cannot really establish a straightforward contradiction that to follow from a single proposition. And that may also mean, this may be a little bit tentative, but it may also mean that Reductio ad absurdum is actually a posteriori method of refutation or proof, however you want to take it, because it uses other hypotheses that are maybe empirically established, or maybe those may also be logical axioms. So if you're talking about logical theory, pure logical theory, may also be using logical axioms as those additional hypotheses, but then it may be a priori. But what I'm saying is that you need independent grounds in order to establish the falsity of some proposition. If that proposition is not itself complex proposition which implicitly contains two propositions which are mutually exclusive. So I hope that's not too complex and it can be understood, but I think I'm onto something here, so I'm trying to explicate it the best I can. I think I did a fairly good job here. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been informative or enjoyable in some way, shape, or form. And I would urge you to subscribe to my channel, to comment, to like, maybe share it with somebody you think may enjoy this. And also you may consider, uh, if that's something you would like to do, to support me through PayPal. I'll try to post a link in the description to my PayPal account. So uh, if you find value in the stuff I'm putting out here, you can try supporting me that way too. So thank you very much again for listening, and until next time, bye bye.